Opening opposition IIUM 5. Closing government UPD 1. And opposing opposition NUS 3. I will be your champion today. Joining me on the panel is Vincent, Chanel, Shoal, Samuel, Abby, and Hakeem. On the motion, I invite the Prime Minister to start today's debate.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, your identity as an oppressed group is integral and important to yourself. It's something that should be self-defined and should come with self-determination. We think that a position of a privileged majority within your discourse would only hamper your ability to self-determine your identity as an oppressed minority. What we feel this policy should be about is that in online forums, social media campaigns, minorities like the LGBT movement, while trying to define who they are and what they want, should exclude the majoritarian group from this discussion. We think that this is important for them to be able to feel comfortable within their discussion and to encourage a discussion that's constructive towards their own identity and defined by themselves for what they actually want in that discussion. We think this debate is primarily about identity-based social movement, such as individuals who are homosexuals, transsexuals, individuals that identify with certain identity. Our position is that privileged groups should be able to support movement. Things like sign petitions, pledge supports the causes of this minority. Those are things we're happy with. What we don't want is for their views to oppress, convolute the message and identity of these minorities. So we are happy with them supporting this cause, not actively imposing their view or participating or controlling the views of this minority. No, thank you. What do you feel? Why we feel that way? Firstly, let's talk about how empowerment is a zero-sum game. Firstly, the empowerment of a minority needs to always come at the expense of the privilege of the majority. That means that the majority have to accept that they are part of the discrimination as well. So we think that what we need to do is, and we're happy to empower the minority in this situation at the expense of the majority. We think that individuals who are within the group of majority are usually apprehensive because they are not able to fully internalize their privilege. Therefore, their engagement with that discussion is more or less unconstructive usually. We think that, for example, individuals who are discriminated, for example, the African American community, who have been discriminated for years and went through a lot of oppression, cannot possibly be in the same position to speak, for example, as an individual from the middle class group who can't possibly internalize the amount of discrimination that that person has. We think that that individual then cannot define or control the discourse about African Americans in that context. No, thank you. Secondly, we say that identity is socially constructed based on circumstances. Circumstances such as discrimination, oppression, and circumstances surrounding you. So most of these things are intrinsic to and unique to different circumstances. Identity also can be defined by themselves, internally as well as externally by the community. What we do not want is that identity to be defined externally by privileged majorities who aren't able to internalize what they go through. Because what we feel is better is their identity exclusively defined by them, so that they are able to self-determine, so that they are able to feel comfortable voicing out their own opinions. For people within the minority group who feel not empowered to come up because they always feel that their views and their identity is always defined by the larger majority, this is the only way for them to come up, speak up, and feel comfortable that their identity is not always subject to scrutiny of the larger majority, regardless of whether or not they're allies. Realize that even though they're allies, doesn't necessarily mean that they fully understand or internalize the fight that these individuals go through, but they might be more coercive and more imposing because one, they're the majority, as well as they are more influential in society. That means that they might be more imposing on their views upon this minority, making it hard for them to internalize their identity. No, thank you. We also think that underprivileged groups are disenfranchised from forming their identity under status quo. That means that because of the lack of political capital, as well as the more authority the larger majority have to define the identity of the minority, that means that it's harder for them to fight against the larger majority if the larger majority participate in that discourse as well. We think that that's particularly problematic because that means that you reduce the legitimacy of the minority groups within that particular discourse. For example, if you always let individuals from the larger straight majority define the way the homosexual movement should go about, the homosexual movement are significantly weaker to fight that larger influence that they have. Excluding them from the discourse means they're able to self-determine and define and be more legitimate as a group as opposed to the comparative. Go ahead, closing.
So, like, this privileged class will always be a small minority group within that vulnerable community. How would their voices, given in a small number, be able to drown out everyone else?
Let's talk about the comparative right now. Because in this debate, what if we're pushing the privileged majority away? Firstly, we don't think that they will all be pushed away. Because individuals who are privileged, who are allies and support this cause, are largely sympathetic towards this cause. Just because they don't fully internalize those things doesn't mean they're unsympathetic and will move away. They're also educated enough and socially progressive enough to want to allow this minority, when they come up and say we want to define ourselves, allow them to define themselves. So we think that in itself will allow them to be within the movement as well. But we also think, however, if we push the privilege away, what is the comparative? Because the only individuals and the only part of privileged groups that we are pushing away are individuals who actively want to define the minority movement for themselves. That means that individuals who are straight, who want to define the homosexual movements, are the only people that we push away. Because now that they don't have control and power over the movement, then they move away. Those are individuals that we don't mind letting go within the discourse because their views are always and often imposing. So even if they are part and the reason why we achieve some changes for minority groups such as the transsexual movement or the homosexual movement, we don't think that change is meaningful because it's not necessarily in the best interest of individuals who are actually affected by those policies. So policies, for example, of the for a transsexual individual are extremely complicated. So we don't think that just by larger majority groups define what you think they want means that it will bring any benefit to them whatsoever. We think that's extremely important in this debate. But at the end of the day, what we need to realize is that the minority group are always disenfranchised when it comes to forming their identity if you always allow the larger community to drown out their own voices in issues that matter the most to themselves. We think that self-determination is most important to your identity, and you should define what kind of policies help you and what you want within this movement. We're extremely proud.
Sorry. Are you ready?
The laptop is like 10 sounds to
Maybe don't put it that way.
For years, privileged white males have excluded women, blacks, minority communities on the basis of their identity. If minority communities start to exclude white males simply on the basis of their identity, you're only going to further entrench the notion of us versus them, of males against females, of whites against black, of us against the rest of the world. In order to formulate some kind of justice in this world, we need to move beyond identity politics and go at the heart of the debate, i.e. gender equality and equality for all. Ladies and gentlemen, to go with this policy is to only exacerbate the problem. There are two arguments coming from opening opposition. Firstly, we'll talk about identity. And secondly, we'll talk about integration. Simple enough. Rebuttals will be integrated. Let's look into how identity as a social construct is inherently formed. Like I said earlier, identity cannot be solely defined based on social exclusion. Necessarily, blacks in the United States of America are different from blacks in Cape Town, for instance. The differences in their lived experience is due to the fact they live in different communities. White in Cape Towns behave differently from whites in Atlanta, in Georgia, for instance. Because of the minute differences, the lived experience of being black is inherently different. Therefore, in order to formulate some kind of identity, you need to have some kind of input from the society around you. They claim that these people have internalized their oppression, and this internalization speaks for a form of unique experiences. This is weird, because this form of internalization only stems from the fact that you were oppressed but previously by the whites within your community. And this is particularly important in this debate, because the privileged allies are the only people who are in the best position to fix that kind of problem. Your privileged allies are the only ones who are in the best kind of position to actually ask for forgiveness and move for reconciliation, rather than exacerbating the policies and the problems of identity politics. That's the first thing. But furthermore, if you're going to entrench identity politics, if you're creating that narrative that is us versus them, you're only going to highlight the fact that I am a privileged person, and when I look at my privilege, that I should keep my privilege, as opposed to the narrative of the social movement overall. Because the narrative of social movement, civil rights, tend to transcend identity politics. For instance, when blacks ask for the right to vote, they do not ask for the right to vote simply because they are black. They ask for the right to vote simply because they are human, and whites should recognize them for being human. When we're looking from the perspective of privileged allies, these are the form of individuals who recognize that their identity as a white male is no longer important. But what's most important here is our collective identity as human beings. And as human beings, we deserve equal rights. If you're going to create this form of division, you're only going to give legitimacy towards the narrative that we are white and we should protect our own, and you are black and you should protect your own. Therefore, the whole social movement breaks down. Therefore, the identity as a social construct needs to be taken into consideration with the people that you live with, as opposed to it's developed exclusively as a form of isolation. But thirdly, opening government is particularly disingenuous, because when we're talking about privileged allies, most cases they are not imposing, they are merely participating. And when they are participating, they are largely at the behest of the democratic demand from the people on the ground. There are three reasons why imposition is extremely unlikely. Firstly, these privileged allies are already extremely sympathetic and sensitive towards the voices of the downtrodden. Therefore, they are more accurate, they are more likely to portray the accurate voices of the people on the ground. But secondly, imposition, if you impose, you run the risk of not having some kind of authenticity. When you don't have authentic voice behind whatever you're portraying, you yourself as a privileged allies, for instance, lose all forms of political legitimacy. Therefore, since your legitimacy stems from the democratic movement down the line, you are forced to cater towards the demand. But thirdly, like Andre has pointed out, even if they are imposing, they are in small numbers, and more often than not, this imposition only works in a very small, isolated white communities, and not toward the larger mainstream discourses where the discourse is most effective. Jasmine.
So if your privileged majority are always individuals that are cooperative to the movement, why would they leave the movement the moment this movement wants to self-define?
Because you shun them. Because you shun them based on their identity politics. That's why they are more likely to feel hurt. These fancitas are more likely to say, no, no, it's us versus them. We have to protect our own interests. They just want to protect for their own interests. You increases the communal divide that is already existing within status quo. Let's move on towards second argument then. How do you help integration? We think privileged communities, privileged allies have specific advantages that minorities movement do not have. Firstly, yes, because they are privileged, they have control over media. This makes, given that their message is authentic towards by the demand of the people, they make the representation of these minority cultures more visible in the mainstream culture. That's first thing. But secondly, they have vast overarching networks over privileged communities that minorities do not have, i.e., those white communities in Westboro Baptist Church communities where they are not naturally and organically exposed towards the lived experiences of the minority cultures. Because of this exposure, you're able to change the minds whose minds needed change the most. But thirdly, they have the most capital, because lack of capital among minority communities lead to disenfranchisement. Given that minority cultures, even if they're able to express themselves as realistically, as authentically as possible, if they are not able to express their voice towards the mainstream culture, that self-defined culture is worthless because it doesn't have any form of acceptance. That's why we need the help of the position of the privileged life to voice out and amplify the voice of the minority culture. But fourthly, you also reduce resistance within the minority, within the dominant culture, in order to accept it, because other people can see that these privileged allies have accepted the identities that these minority cultures have defined for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, going with government's proposal only entrenches the norm of us versus them.
We are happy to see that the opening opposition admits the amount of privilege and power in terms of networking, media control, everything that the opposition talked about at the end of their speech, which seems to contradict the point of information from the closing opposition about them being a minority group, but despite being a minority group, being so goddamn powerful, ladies and gentlemen, but doesn't seem to realize that that privilege may translate into the internal discourse between that privileged group as well as the minority group that we're talking about in this particular circumstance, ladies and gentlemen. This means that if you are an identity-based group that's trying to define yourself, ladies and gentlemen, you are fundamentally unable to overpower the privileged majority, no matter how small, in your community, ladies and gentlemen, when you're still trying to formulate your own identities. Let's first make some clarifications. First and foremost, we are not isolating and disengaging completely and in totality the privileged majority. We are saying that at the point in stage where you still have not self-defined what you want and who you are and what your place in society, that is the part in which exclusion happens. It doesn't mean that broader advocacy and broader conversations with the majority in terms of making them understand their privilege, in terms of getting them to sign on, those things can happen under our side as well. But if that comes at the expense, ladies and gentlemen, of you having convoluted demands that are manipulated by self-interest of privileged majorities, then whatever you advocate to the majority, ladies and gentlemen, is not representative and do not address the problems of the identity groups that we're talking about on the outside of the house. That's why it was not enough for them to run a generic case of exclusion of identity groups under the opening opposition. The second thing is about lived experiences, because they tell us the minority groups all experience the same thing, different things, and sometimes majority groups experience some things as well. Yes, we agree that some people may experience poverty of the same level, but the broader difference, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is about identity in general. This means there are some things that are immutable characteristics of Black individuals that that a white person will never have to face. The fact that you are 60% more likely to be shot when you're arrested if you are a black person by the virtue of your skin color, ladies and gentlemen, or being turned down for loans. The fact that if you're transgendered, ladies and gentlemen, that's an identifiable, immutable characteristic that a straight person will never have to face. So sure, poverty is something that goes across the board, but being black isn't, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you are going to face. If you are a rich black person or a poor black person, you are equally just as likely to be shot of a policeman in the outside of a house. And that's why we think that, broadly speaking, the discrimination people face are sectioned into categories of identifiable minority groups that we're talking about on the outside of the house. That's why they needed to engage. In my speech, ladies and gentlemen, which will engage to the rest of the material, will be in regards to why in the internal discussions of minority groups, minority leaders as well as the people who want to lead discussion will be systematically disenfranchised, and why the demands as well as the discourse that is provided by privileged majorities will horribly convolute and corrode the message of minority groups. But before going further, yes, sir.
Why are you still not substantiating this analysis of imposition? You're not giving you true rebuttals on why these allies are more likely to be sympathetic towards the causes of the downtrodden.
That's because you were not responsive to the analysis Jasmine provided in regards to individuals not being able to acknowledge their own privilege. The fact that even if you're sympathetic, you aren't able to fully appreciate how much that you may be imposing on someone. The fact, ladies and gentlemen, that a lot of feminist men today still cannot internalize the fact that some language can imply microaggressions onto women, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that not a lot of people can understand the full appreciation of how much you discriminate against certain minority groups. And that's why it's important to self-determine. That's why you needed to respond in that regard. So that's why I'm going to talk about my argument right now. No, sit down. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm responding directly to the point information from the closing opposition. Because not only did the leader of opposition do a little bit of work for me, so I have a little bit of extra time for other analysis, it's the fact that, ladies and gentlemen, when you are in a comparative between listening to a black individual in black discourse versus a white individual, there's sometimes something called an internalized inferiority complex. And that's especially important. The fact for 900 or 200 years, slavery as well as treatment as second-class citizens were internalized in, for example, communities that were impoverished, in massive black communities that have already internalized that they're not part of the system, that they will always be disenfranchised and their vote doesn't matter, ladies and gentlemen. There are many things that might happen when they see a white person already existed in the discourse. Either number one, they disengage completely because they think to themselves, I'm apathetic, I will never be able to outpower the amount of capital this individual has or the amount of power and legitimacy this individual has. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this individual might internalize that inferiority complex to the extent that I might listen to the white person more because he seems more legitimate in comparison to my black leaders in some circumstances. That is especially important because that delegitimizes your own identity group at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. And that especially means that you are less and less able to self-define your own identity group through your own internalized discrimination and your insidious ways of prioritizing one privileged group over the minority group, ladies and gentlemen. That's why, even from the inside, that's insidiously bad for individuals, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's especially important. But secondly, we think that the contrast of seeing two individuals, one white, one black, on stage allows individuals to make that comparison and delegitimizes the black individual more. Because if you see a white person that fits your description of what is legitimate, wearing a suit, being a polished politician, Harvard educated, versus a person from Black Lives Matter who seems to be a disheveled individual who comes from the street, ladies and gentlemen, that contrast allows individuals to internalize that they should delegitimize people of their own community more because they've internalized all these standards of patriarchy or racial discrimination under that side of us. That contrast is especially important. But lastly, under that side, they told us that we highlight privilege to people and make them want to defend it even more. Disregarding the analysis that Jasmine provided about these are the exact same people who do not recognize their privilege enough that if they were included in the discussion, they would have included their privilege and mitigated people's demands anyway. So at best case scenario on the opposition, these are people who would have mitigated and diluted your demands to the point that's unrecognizable from the original intent of that particular group. Because they say, maybe I don't discriminate people that much. Maybe I'm not really that part of that group. Therefore, diluting that message in total. That's a best case scenario of people who are sympathetic, ladies. But worst case scenario, these are individuals of the privileged majority, ladies and gentlemen, that want to opt out These are the individuals that have misconceptions, at least, ladies and gentlemen. These are people who think that perhaps it's okay to call a gay person, forgive my language, a fag. Maybe it's about calling a woman a particular thing. Or maybe it's okay, a positive concept isn't something that they think is correct to imply onto people, ladies and gentlemen. These are the misconceptions that even the best of people have in many scenarios, and maybe integrated in the kind of demands that you have within those minority groups. That's why, at the end of this opening half, ladies and gentlemen, we were the only team to be able to prove to you that identity is a separate discussion that needs to be determined first before you can face society and tell people what your demands are, and that can only be happening internally, where you know who you are and your place in society. We are exceedingly proud to propose.
Until when do you want blacks and the minorities and all these individuals to continuously be differentiated from everybody else? Until when? Because they never gave us a mechanism for change on how these things are actually going to actualize in reality. We think we do. I don't know why we're the government in this debate, but that's what happened. Two questions in this debate. Number one, are you still able to self-determine if there's a majority within your group? Secondly, this thing about inferiority complex. And number three, how do you actually initiate long-term change? So are you still able to self-determine? And here I think Mifsal was being extremely disingenuous, right? Because he said, look, white people have a large majority. They control the media. Let me nuance it for you, because Audi already told you that within these small communities, that media and that discourse is primarily controlled by black individuals or by those minority individuals. Outside of those communities, however, is where that media is controlled by everybody else. That means that if you have those minority individuals talking within those public forums, talking within the internet, or whatever it is that you want to talk about, that privileged majority is the minority in that case, because they don't have those same control structures that happen outside. The reason this is true is because minority cultures will always group together, right? You have extremely concentrated subsets of culture, like what happens in the Bronx, for example, or what happens within communities that the privileged majority or the minority cannot penetrate. That's why it's extremely important. That's number one. But number two, sit down. The reason why that small minority is super important is twofold. Number one, you have to allow that discourse to happen, because you ultimately have to realize who are black people trying to portray their identity to. You think black people are trying to prove their identity to other black people? No, they're trying to prove their identity to the privileged majority, to the white individuals. And the reason that they're doing that is because they're continuously discriminated against. These individuals, sit down. I posit to you that these individuals are already are not super new. Like black individuals have lived within America for a really, really long time, 60 odd years, and they already have that self-identity. Who they want to prove it to, sit down. Who they want to prove it to are necessarily those white individuals. And that means sit down. But then after you tell me, wait, it doesn't mean that they are continuously crowds that privileged majority and the formation of their identity. The reason why that doesn't happen is because, number one, given that your identity is something that's eternally evolving and that will never change, you would rather have it in a context where reality actually occurs, because you will never be able to offset that, or you will always have to deal with that discrimination on that majority. And therefore, we posit to you that under our side, it's better that that context and that discourse happens under reality and not some fake dream that happens under your side. That's number one. But number two, they said, sorry, B, yeah, still under the same course, right? They said, look, it's internalized, and therefore we will never be able to change. Is this true? Because they said that white people will never be able to understand microaggression and all these things that happen towards females. Yes, but then how do you change that internalization? Is it by white people only hearing it in mythical tales? No, it's by white people or by males talking to females about it and hearing about microaggression, and that can only happen if that discourse occurs within the identity of those individuals. That's number one. Sorry. But number two, sit down. The reason why it's not internalized, or the internalization doesn't happen, is because the value that the majority adds is necessarily the perspective of those individuals, right? So when you come up here and you tell me that a white person adds nothing, we think that that white person does add a certain perspective that widens the view of those black individuals. Before I go on to my second issue, yes.
The identity formation stage lets me define what microaggressions make me uncomfortable. Why can't I tell privileged groups what those categories are once I define them, rather than let them be involved before we actually decide what they are?
All right, Reggie, Jay-Z, Tupac, and Biggie, Andre from Outkast, Nada, and then blacklist that occurs because that a microaggression and that identity has already been formed. That's the legendary song, by the way. But look, the reason is because those microaggressions and that identity will never finish, right? And you want to have, and that discussion is always going to be evolving. So the comparative is, do you want that discussion to happen within a dream, or do you want that discussion to happen with the perspective of the majority? We want it to be with the perspective of the majority, where we can tell you what is most effective and what that microaggression is. Sit down. Secondly, inferiority complex. Number two, they said, look, individuals are already have a very small subset of their culture. Now, is this true? Because we can always see that those smaller minorities are necessarily proud of their culture and they want to forward that culture. So that complex is necessarily untrue. But sit down. But number two, this is opposite to what social movements do and what they portray anyway. What they necessarily tell you is that they do have a large portion of that minority. And that means that when you tell me that they see a black person who comes up to being disheveled, this is like so racist, right? Like, what, you think black people cannot wear suits? Of course they can wear suits. But the perspective that occurs when you're talking towards the majority is that they tell you that perhaps the best way to forward your identity is through you wearing suits. Because that dishevelment and that inferiority complex will always exist under your side. We think we want to change that. Third of all, how do you initiate long-term change? And this is extremely, extremely important, because ultimately we have to recognize quotas, scholarships, like all of these things are ultimately stopgap measures. We want to live in a world, and opening opposition wants to live in a world where eventually these things will be unnecessary. At the point where you tell black people that this matters, we think that that's when you will never be able to constitute change. Ultimately, what we have to tell people is that it's about being human, and it's about what rationalizes us between ourselves and not the skin color that differentiates us. I'm so goddamn proud to oppose.
when people were outraged when Bernie Sanders said that all lives matter in response to a question about whether Black lives matter, it wasn't a denial of the innate humanity that lies within the white people or within the majority, but it was a question of privilege and intersectionality. It was a question of the fact whether Black lives are currently facing struggles that are unique to them being Black within status quo. We have to contextualize as closing government what social movements need at this point in time to be able to respond to opening debate, and second, what discourse actually means, and to what extent that discourse impacts the ability of these social movements to be able to forward change. We'd say we are fortunate to have moved past the Stonewall riots of the 1970s, fortunate to no longer need the recognition that men and women are different. So we would say, coming from closing government, we have very broad recognitions of privilege and the lack thereof, but not necessarily very specific discussions about that. So the real question is about how we move forward. How do Muslim women forward their identity within a feminist movement who has mostly been white, who has mostly been Christian, for instance, who feel a sense of empowerment from things that are thought to be oppressive expressions of their identity, like the hijab, for instance, and that sense of religiosity, or the Black feminists who feel excluded from a very much white feminist movement. So the question of this debate is really about that intersectionality. It's both destructive in nature, which is breaking through barriers that are unique to certain individuals based on that intersectionality of identities, but also constructive in nature, which is about the ability to construct niche identities which are not necessarily supported in status quo. The link we're going to provide here, it's not only the fact that we are pushing away privileged allies, which is mostly what opening government talked about, but to the exclusion of these privileged allies, we are making the discussion centric on non-privileged allies. So to that extent, we from closing government are perfectly fine and perfectly embrace African Americans participating in the conversation. We perfectly embrace Muslims participating in the conversation, and we think they should be the focal point in any social movement discussion to work to the extent that we are forwarding the rights of the most vulnerable. Second, we're going to talk about discourse. The very hazy notion of discourse coming from opening debate must be dispelled, and we'll talk about how discourse is about setting the goalposts for that oppression and fighting that oppression, and it's also about understanding the very root of that oppression, and it's also about mostly communities' acceptance. But before that, a few extraneous responses to opening debate. One, the biggest problem with opening debate is they really lumped in the exclusion from the exclusion, and they ran a very generic case about that form of exclusion. We'd say it's a significantly different form of exclusion to have someone excluded from discourse, which is what this debate is about, and the other forms of exclusion that they're talking about, which is body politic or telling someone that they have no rights in society. It's a radically different thing to say that a Black person, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Sure, you're excluding whites from that leadership position, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're telling them that they have no rights in society. So all the exclusion points that they are talking about won't necessarily materialize if they're saying that these people are really as sympathetic as they are. But more importantly, in response to this point about the whites from Cape Town and the whites from Washington, we have absolutely no reason to treat the whites from Cape Town and the whites from Washington as absolutely the same. In fact, we would say that's more likely on their side, precisely because all humans' lives matter rather than a specific set of lives matter, or a specific set of lives matter more insofar as intersectionality is concerned. We can approximate perfectly how privileged you are based on an intersectionality of class, sex, and race. And this is perfectly understood by the very privileged allies that they're talking about. So to the extent that oppression and exclusion is best formed, we think that's actually under opening opposition to the exclusion of these identities that we're talking about. But second, they said we have vast opportunities that we want to be able to use, networks and capital. Wait, if the provision of these privileged allies, of these networks, of this capital is provided based on the conditionality in the discourse, we are perfectly fine with letting that go, because that means it's not a genuine appreciation of our interest, it's not a genuine appreciation for cloud, and it doesn't necessarily, and we'd say that we don't want that to exist anyway. We'd say that to the extent that these networks and capital are no longer forwarding the interests of these individuals, we'd say we're perfectly fine with letting them go. I'll take a POI now.
So, if as you say that these privileged ones do not understand so much, why can't we make them understand, given that they have to enter into this enclave where they are the minority?
No. First, it's not just about understanding insofar as we're talking. I'll talk about discourse later on, but it's not just understanding insofar as forwarding the movement, but it's even about setting the goalposts first. Because if they participate in the conversation at the beginning and say that maybe those goals aren't as important, then we don't even get to where that POI already asking. And it's not to say that understanding can be brought in a 5-minute lecture video. It's about the life that you lead and exactly the sorts of aggression that you face on a daily basis. So it's not something that you can just easily teach. First, let's talk about constructive engagements of identity. We'd say what we're doing from closing government is making privilege the focal point of the discussion insofar as the social movements are concerned. And this is where we're going to take most of the analysis coming from open government, that a lot of minorities are being turned off, there's more freedom to engage, but we're going to conclude it 3 ways. First, we think this is a more important issue of how different minorities facing the same exclusion from society find problems within each other, and within the very movement that they're saying. We're talking about infighting, for example, within the feminist movement, of black feminists feeling that they're not represented and wishing to secede from the feminist movement, for instance. We'd suggest that it's fundamentally unproductive and fundamentally counterproductive to the greater goal of these movements in the first place. But second, it's also about less intelligent conversations about intersectionality and privilege themselves, to the extent that these privileged allies, because of their capital, because of all the things the opening opposition are talking about, are dominating the conversation and dominating the discussion. They set goalposts that aren't necessarily as far as they want to be. They make the fights easier than they should be, Mr. Speaker, by just saying that we should be fighting for rights of women in general, just as opposed to fighting for the rights of African American women in specific and insofar as their rights are concerned. This is where we want to talk about discourse, as setting goal points and understanding the root of the very oppression that these individuals face on a daily basis. We would suggest the community's ability to be able to accept the discourse that we are forwarding to them is conditional upon them understanding that these people who are forwarding that discourse do not suffer from the very same privilege that they have. So if white people, for instance, see that most of the discourse is spurred on by these white individuals, they don't have an impetus to be able to accept that those claims are legitimate, and that form of oppression is really, really important. So to that extent, we would say that this debate is not just about a broad notion of exclusion, but one of the most important discourses that we want to be able to forward as a movement. It's about identifying who you are. It's about identifying your enemy. It's about identifying how you get to where you want to be. And because of that, we're extremely proud to propose.
The speaker will speech. Now let's invite the opposition
We're going to come in closing opposition to tell you that this debate is not about crafting what is the most ideal or accurate identity that a person of a minority group ought to be able to craft. It's about the ability to have that crafted identity being bought into by society, and if you never get that identity accepted by society, it doesn't matter if you think that it's most genuine of your own, society doesn't buy into it, and you still get discriminated exactly on those bases. But before that, several responses, especially for closing government. First, it's about this whole idea of intersectionality, right? Somehow, if white privileged individuals start to fight for black people, somehow we lose out this aspect of like black women because like race and gender are just two separate issues. But the thing is, an amalgamation of a bigger class of people naturally also means that you get more diverse opinions and diverse community groups. That means that maybe sometimes your issues are not isolated to one type of people. It could very well be about rich black women as well, and you only get the diversity of those opinions if you include more people. But the idea that then they brought up, right, which is the idea that, look, we cannot have white people representing black people because it seems as though that you are using the oppressors to represent us, and you turn away people on the ground who have felt the brunt of those oppression. Well, no, Ray. Why? Because oftentimes these allies from the white community are people who can empathize. But more than that, once they will concede to their mistake, they will admit and also shed light to the origins of where these mistakes were. Oftentimes, it's not because they were genuinely evil human beings, but because of cultural norms that facilitated patriarchy that imposes itself upon these vulnerable groups. And oftentimes, seeking closure and understanding from where the oppressors were is also important for you to find out how best to fight for your rights. So it's not that you'll turn them away. In fact, you rally them together to understand what type of white people we should fight against, and not just all types of white people. No, thank you. And this is when we talk about the main thrust coming from opening government. They told us that you will never understand our plight and best stay out of our conversation. That's not true, right? Oftentimes, it's the basic humanity that people can relate to that keeps you in the fight, right? When you feel the injustices. But really, sometimes it's about allowing the privileged class to understand that this oppression is on lines of unconstitutionality that we can fight on, right? That gay marriages ought to be legalized, not because I feel a great thing for gay people, but just because it's what we've been given to anyway. So you don't need someone to feel your pain to be able to fight on those metrics of unfairness, right? But second of all, right, when you are part of these rallies, when you're part and intimately proximate to those realities, right, oftentimes this is the best way to interact with people, to understand their pains. That the personification of abuses comes in seeing and meeting and greeting people from those vulnerable communities to better understand their plight and therefore better represent them in your communities. But also times, right? Then no thank you. It's also important to involve them because these are the people. They will eventually be the vessel of information when you reach out to the most isolated of communities. When I take part in a gay pride parade, and I know that actually these people are not promiscuous shitheads that are going to destroy and bring the devil to our communities, it is when I bring it back home, when I tell my most bigoted mom and dad that, look, I have gay friends, I was part of the parade, and there was nothing wrong with it. Number one, the fact that it comes from me, not from them, is easier to buy by them. But more than that, even if I don't speak to my families, right? The fact that when I go to the greater community and it's a white guy or a straight guy speaking out on behalf of them, there's a greater sense of credence to what you're saying, and there's a greater sense of buying into those concepts. No, thank you. But I say, look, well, no, it's gonna crowd out, right? Because somehow, for some weird reason, the minute I see someone, I like to buy into him. No, ladies and gentlemen, the greater community of vulnerables are fighting together, not because they didn't get a suit to wear, or not because I just see you as a friend, because they have a common suffering that binds them together. A guy comes in a white suit is not going to buy me away from the fact that I've suffered oppression, I've been denied opportunities, and merit just doesn't apply to me. Those sufferings don't just disappear, right? And therefore, just because you're in a suit doesn't change my mind. Even if I buy that somehow that has implications, the only implications is that I will see a stark contrast in your privileged position and my sense of suffering and disparity. This gives me greater urgency to fight for my cause, and that's a generally good thing, right? Opening.
Your benefits can be achieved in post-identity formation discussion. But under your side, may you please tell us why people will be so altruistic that there's no self-interest in them imposing themselves in the internal discussion of what the demands of the students are.
I'm going to tell you they have self-interest. And I'm going to exactly tell you why it's important to craft that later on, before getting acceptance. Why? Because oftentimes, being able to pass anti-discrimination law means you have to compromise directly to people who are in the privileged sector. Giving women more rights means taking away rights from men. Giving gay people rights means forcing upon yourself, upon religious communities, to give them things like marriage ceremonies. This means that at any point where you want to pass something that gives more rights to the minority, you take away rights from the majority. This means to say you need them to understand and also value how much they can compromise in order for them to buy into your rhetoric, right? Because number one, people have different ideas of where these injustices were and what's the commensurate amount of reparations to give to individuals or to uplift those communities, right? And this means that if I support a quota, I need to be part of understanding what is the right amount of quota to be given women in parliament or in businesses. When you want to force me to give higher wages to women, when you force me to give mandatory extended maternity leave, as an employer, I need to be part of the discussion because you are taking away from me. You are taking away my profits. You are taking away my standard in society. That means to say, if I don't understand what those discourses were, if I was never a participant in those like those ventilation of opinions, I may not accept it when you force it out upon me out in society. When you try to pass a radical bill that I will never buy because it takes up too much for me. One, you may think it's fair for you to further the identity and take away what's right from me because that's your right. But the minute I don't buy into it, I'm going to rally together with all the other privileged class, even if I was your ally, to go against that bill, counterintuitive to my self-interest and my position in society. It's a harsh reality, but people only give in if they don't see themselves being overly compromised. If somebody just to give you free rights, I'm not going to give that to you, right? And only if I understand that that's parity, and only if I understand that there's an amount of to give you, only when I fully personify the kind of sufferings and thereby be willing to give you those rights, that's where I'm willing to vote on your behalf and keep my allegiance. This allegiance is not for time immemorial. At the point I'm threatened, I can always turn my backs against you, and we don't want that risk to happen. Thank you.
When Andre said in the first minute of the speech that we'd rather have the discourse accepted than the discourse be fully representative, we think that this is insidious, because you need to realize that the grasp or the root of that analysis is that there are some parts of the movement that we're willing to accept and there are some parts that we aren't. And we think that that's not okay, particularly because if you want to be able to fight for a movement about commonality and about human rights, you don't have to pick and say that this is okay and this is what we can fight for, and at some points in time we're not okay to accept other things. That's bad. We think, guys, that there's several ways to be accepted in society, but there's only one way to have that particular discourse. That is why that trade-off is so important, and that's why you can't let go of it, because we need to recognize at the moment you have one strong discourse, it's so easier to lobby yourself in so many other instances and so many other alternatives. Because at least, even if society does not recognize its own plight or the plight of that particular movement, at least members of that movement, this is what we're fighting for, and this is what we're going to stand against. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that Andre's entire speech of, well, they're not going to be participative and it's going to be bad because participation is important. These are arguments that are against the exclusion of the participation and of exclusion of discourse. So all your benefits will still happen on our side the moment they still participate, right? If you think about it, the question is, what is the gay pride or gay movement or the LGBT movement fighting for? Because this is what is this debate about. You need to recognize that this entire concept of, well, there's going to be a stark difference. We think that's true. In fact, it really recognizes that the moment you see the stark differences between privileges, it also hampers the way you set goals for your particular movement. And I'm going to say, ladies and gentlemen, that in your debate, if you see the stark differences, you're going to peg your goals on those limiting extremely high, limiting the extent of the goals that your movement wants to fight for. And that's bad. And more importantly, if they say that we're going to majority, this is bad, we disagree, because we realize, ladies and gentlemen, that if it's true, we're perfectly fine with taking away the rights of that majority, because we need to recognize that the minority or the other people were oppressed because that majority wanted to oppress them. So they were empowered to some extent at the expense of other people being disempowered in that society. So we're perfectly fine with taking away some of their. I need to understand this concept because I might not be able to want to give away my rights in the future. This is an important concession that most of their arguments will be nuanced, especially if you want to keep bargaining for those rights. That means that when you enter the discussion table, you're going to want to keep on bargaining for your rights as well. That's an important concession to say that, oh, they're more likely now to dominate the war and to towards their cause. And we think that's inherent, that's extremely bad. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the first question that we need to argue is that we need to answer is that what is identity and how do we act on it based on that identity? We think that this entire concept of opening opposition, oh, but we highlight this concept of it's going to be us versus them. But then it said that identity politics transcends identity. This is true. We do have a common humanity, and it's going to be bad for you guys to say that we can't accept that. But even if that identity is a social construct, you are empowered and oppressed because of that identity. So the conclusion, different from open government's conclusion, is that that's why it's important to voice out that identity, because the basis of your discrimination should not have been there, and it's based on that identity. Yeah. The voicing out with or without identity only says that it's correct to fight for human individuals, but it's not. It doesn't outrightly say that it's bad to discriminate based on Black individuals as well. We need to be able to highlight these discriminations to nuance our solutions, particularly to these individuals as well. And we think that doesn't happen on your side. But you think, ladies and gentlemen, the question of, but how does common humanity lose itself? We think that if you look at it, these things can coexist in the long run. It's okay to fight for your humanity, but also fight for you being Black. It's just that when you, for example, say that this is completely a human aspect or completely a commonality aspect, the nuances that are important to being Black, for example, or to being a woman loses out in the process, and you don't want to be able to see them. You're essentially blind individuals and say that this is only a problem of your humanity. Even, for example, it's a problem about race, it's a problem about sexuality, and those are the kinds of things that you lose out. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, they tell us that change can only happen when the oppressors are included in that discourse. And then this is why they're arguing that, oh, but they'll talk to them. But the question is, how will they understand, even if they're part of that discourse already? Because there's already a strong narrative, and the only way for you to understand if there's a strong narrative posed against you. But the question is, how do you even get to the point of? And it's only possible when individuals get to talk among themselves. That's why even understanding at your point of time is also a question of what is the level of understanding, or what kind of understanding will people have under your model? You're going to say that the understanding is also towards their privilege or towards the kinds of benefits that they already have. And I want to talk about a movement that's already vulnerable in and of itself. You need to be able to empower that vulnerable movement. But sure, open.
Your entire analysis is a concession, because you're telling me that we need to understand the subtle nuances of what happens inside Black communities. How do individuals understand?
Okay, one, this is about discourse. This is about creating what you perceive yourself. So all your arguments about what will society look at you in the future, in the past, in the future, well, the identity that people form first before you understand whatever discourse or whatever participation that you have on your side. But this is where our extension was for, because we argued about intersectionality, the focal point of how you're going to look at those kinds of things. One, you need to realize that movements have factions in and of themselves. They have gradients, ladies and gentlemen. And the moment you have a strong ally that is particularly minority, you also lose out on other parts of that gradient. But more importantly, the goals that you set were not based on the basis, but on what are the kinds of benefits that your allies already have. So it essentially loses out on the goals that people want to set for themselves. And these are the barriers that Leo Maro has been talking to you. At the moment we destroy these barriers by taking out other people existing, that's what longer goals and stronger goals for themselves in the long run. But more importantly, this entire concept is also constructive, is that we also protect the individuals who are most vulnerable. These are individuals, ladies and gentlemen, who the movement was even made for in the first place. So you can't just say that this is about those majority or the allies, because the movement is not for them. The moment that you say that the movement should always accompany them, you also are okay losing out other people in the process. For all these reasons, we've never been proud of it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, our best case scenario is not a diluted message. Our best case scenario was a world that people empathize and belong as one. And I can't understand any greater image than exactly a black man and a white man standing next to each other in parity. Saying that anything else was the case was incredibly antithetical to everything we sought to stand for in the first place. Two things we're going to discuss. How do we first break the internalized privilege individuals have? And second, how do we best forward the messages that we want to achieve for these groups? Now, this is the reason why the government's case is kind of pointless, because a big part of their case just described the problems that we encounter in today's world. But little of their case discuss either how we're going to make it realize the internal privileges, or second, will always be oppressed in any of the characterizations they tried to bring forth. It was convenient on their part, but let's take them at their best. We think that if you accept that as an internalized privilege, my important question to you then, you think that a big guy than the extension of the government, that after they discover what's wrong with themselves, that they can then talk to these people. My suggestion immediately to you is this, that if you thought that internalized privilege happens now, if you exclude them, after you find these identities, how are you going to break through the internalized privilege that you yourself talked about after you discover these privileges later? So thank you. But our extension was this. Opening opposition talked about how the perception of privilege was important. In closing, we want these individuals in all their internalized privilege glory to be in this discourse, because we don't think there's any other way for you to break these sorts of internalized privileges. So thank you. And particularly when it comes to discourse, this is where I answer the closing government's question. The discourse is vitally important, because there's no other way do you really get a start understanding that you have these privileges in the first place. As I say, stand up to your boss who sexually harassed you. Why don't you just go to your governor and get these problem solutions solved? These are the times where you're met with the real answers that I can't do anything about these situations. I'm only going to get understanding that these are privileged scenarios in the first place. And we thought these discussions were really important in those scenarios, and they leave no other alternative in these particular situations. No, thank you. And we thought that this demographic was important. Why? Because they are allies. They're past the first barrier that many other privileged individuals had in the first place. These allies are ones who in the first place thought that to some degree we are perhaps privileged. There's something wrong about how comfortable my life is. And to the extent that these things were important, these are the best candidates to have these discussions with, and the most likely people to be able to bring privileges and be willing to have these discussions in the first place. Okay.
So your benefits are contingent upon those internal discussions being progressive and catered towards those. You can overpower the discussion, no altruistic you are, with all the privilege you have. How are you going to have a problem statement or a demand representing?
My benefit is kind of in the discussion phase, and the fact that these discussions will happen just because that's the point of being allies. But even if it was overpowering, I'm happy to deal with it in my next point. How do we move us forward? Now, the first thing we told you, and we thought was really important, was that, well, the continuing allegiance to these individuals are important. What was the primary rebuttal they heard, both opening and closing? That there's a difference between participation and discourse. If you ask me, for the longest time, discrimination happened precisely upon this particular line of logic. That participation and discourse is exactly the same thing. That just because I allow you to participate in society, your rights as a minority were important, your ability to have discourse was not important. The same thing. Things, Madam Chair, are fundamentally different. And to the extent that being able to discuss these views were important, because at the end of the day, it is a zero-sum game. But to the extent these individuals are important, to be able to make these changes, it was vital to have them on board. Right. What they said, no thank you, nobody government said they're educated. Our worst case scenario, and our best case scenario is that we really turned them away, and that sucks. So we think perhaps the worst case scenario on the other side, where we say these individuals then don't want to support these causes anymore. Does it mean that they object to it? No. But perhaps they just don't vote for it, or they don't support your cause. But why is it particularly important? In the circumstance where you need people to support your cause, first and foremost, leaving these people behind, making these people that have no incentive to come support your cause, or the critical mass to bring these things to light in the first place. No thanks. We thought that was important, particularly because these are individuals who have other rights involved, employers, individuals who have important discussions and rights who are attached to any kinds of discourse or any kinds of movements. So thank you forward on those particular rights regards. Third extension we gave you is that penetration is also an important thing. Opening opposition talked about how using the media was important, and they the government basically shit on this idea. I'm not so sure where I stand on this media thing. No, thank you. But I will say that there are other ways which penetration can happen in much better and more important. And our characterization is a lot more subtle. And to the extent that I don't think that the government's characterization makes sense, I one hand say that, oh, they're minorities, they're too small, but oh, they're also an incredibly imposing and oppressive force because they're too big. That doesn't make sense. So let's perhaps look at the real characterization that perhaps is more sensible. That they are maybe just your friends, like people who you kind of know, and people who are willing to be part of these movements. That's why they're your allies. No, thank you. And to the extent that these are rational, I think this is very important for two particular reasons that Andre gave you. First, and being not always means you need to dominate the media to like package and like blase your opinions into the force. So thank you. I mean, there are many other ways which can be done. And the privileged position of people like being able to have gone to like new media institutions or universities or like they're involved in social discourse and stuff like that means that you are able to be being made. Does it mean that discourse? No, but there are individuals who can advise you how this particular message in a way that can be best received by society at large. So thank you. Second, word of mouth. Being exactly involved, being able to go things, but vital and being able to express other individuals and messages to other people as a whole. What did we hear about closing government? They said that, well, these different groups have different intersectionalities for them to figure out what exactly is the problem. I have 4 responses to this. First, it's incredibly insulting to say that these individuals don't know what they're being oppressed by. Second, we think that to have generalized all kinds of corrective measures that this to a general group. That's how women's rights was developed in the first place. Even though maybe women, it's impossible or very like cabinet to say that all women can benefit from some types of general rights in the first place. So these discourse really is the things that really frustrate them. That's good. That's the thing that puts them in their faces. And that's the kinds of frustration that in general they feel. And if it was about feeling or understanding what exactly they were so frustrated and oppressed by, then discussions with privileged individuals who are passive enough to have discussions with you in the first place makes you really understand where those frustrations lie, especially with the privileged class. So in the worst case now, we thought it was also good in generating the same ends that they wanted in the first place. Fourth and finally, and the point of our extension is that even after you found these particular ways, what really matters, do you get your message across? Because you're always fighting these individuals in the first place. And when you have individuals and allies who really come your cause, the question they need about answer is why do you turn them away? And to the extent that we want to move forward as society as a whole, we're very happy to.
Opening.
Yeah. Hashtag opening bombing.
Our best opening yet, alright? I'll give it that.
Still our best opening.
Really?
Everyone can keep the rules.
Wait, I need to get my bag.
You're big.
So much. Thank you.
Whoa! I was about to say that, but it's come off a little bit green now that you say it. Yeah.